Welcome to the Every Gym podcast. I'm Andy Brady, joined in studio today by our very own pastor, Dr. Jim Thomas. How are you, sir?
I'm good, Andy Brady. How are you?
I'm doing well. Today's episode is Holy Week Part 1. Welcome to the Every Gym podcast. Today, Dr. Thomas and I are speaking on the current sermon series, 8 Days That Changed the World,
Right.
Looking at Holy Week from Sunday to Sunday.
Yep.
I am incredibly excited about this. I have, for about 20 years, I've really wanted to be part of something that did a deep dive into each of the days of Holy Week. It's my first exposure to the concept of Holy Week that I was aware of, right? Because it could have been that just for 20 years I just wasn't paying attention. Was actually in college. There was a local ministry that every day they'd have a big banner up of, Monday of Holy Week. This is what we're doing. Tuesday of Holy Week. Is the concept of Holy Week, not just focusing on Easter or just Palm Sunday, but the concept of Holy Week, has that had an impact on either ministry for you or your walk with Christ?
Oh, absolutely. Baptists in general, as we are in the Baptist world, don't have our own liturgy, our own worship style, our own worship rhythm, but not like, say, what we would call higher church tradition, whether that be even Catholics or Lutherans or Episcopals or Methodists or whatever. Presbyterians who would have a annual liturgy and specific events that they would do throughout Holy Week, whether go back to Lent and doing Ash Wednesday and doing all that kind of stuff. Baptists just kind of skip all that. And in fact, I had a staff member earlier today on the day of this recording that said, someone came to them and said, we spend a lot of time preparing for Christmas, and like 4 weeks preparing for Christmas.
Yeah. And
most of the time in Protestant free church world, it's Palm Sunday, Easter week, Easter, we're done, go on with life, And so I think, a deep dive into this week in Jesus' life is important to allow us more time to really understand all the small implications that went into the huge act that he did for us through his death and resurrection. So, yeah, I think the idea of resurrection specifically, to answer your question, is such a powerful thing for me. It's why I still get choked up at baptisms, because it symbolizes death, burial, resurrection. Life has been changed. Life has been given. Life is new. All of that type of stuff. And even though I've been a Christian now for, 40 years, thinking back to the dead life I was living before I knew Christ, and realizing that I have been given new life, and the only reason that is because of what he did on that week.
Absolutely.
And obviously we can extend that to his whole life from incarnation on through ascension, and he lives now, but because of the actions of that specific week, we have the opportunity for new life, and that just blows me away every time I think about it.
I love that. And it's taking the next 8 weeks as a church and on the run up to Easter Sunday. There's nothing we can do that makes Easter more holy.
Right.
And we don't make the season more holy.
Right.
But what are we hoping, might be some things that we're hoping occurs on the individual level? If we're heightening awareness in the run up to Easter, is there a hope for the congregant? Or for ourselves as we walk through it?
Yeah, I think engaging Jesus in a way that's incredibly intentional and incredibly narrative, and that's one of the things that as a preacher, as a pastor, but as a communicator, I had a pastor one time tell me Easter and Christmas were his easiest times to preach, and I'm like, wow,
they seem intimidating.
Yeah, they seem incredibly intimidating, and most of the people, not everybody, but most of the people have heard the stories over and over and over, some for multiple decades, right? So how do you craft the same story in a way that's engaging? And one of the things I keep falling back on is, from a communication standpoint, the story is the story, and the narrative drives itself.
Yeah.
The thing is to lean hard into that narrative and to go into the intricacies of that so that we see Jesus in a bigger way.
That's good.
And not just three crosses on a hillside, which we'll talk about later, an empty tomb, a sunrise service, the dresses, and everything that goes with our modern version of Easter and how we celebrate. But to dive into deeper relational narrative, to dive deeper into opposition narrative, to dive deeper into theological narrative, right?
Yeah.
So why is he doing what he's doing? Well, there are biblical and theological ramifications to almost everything Jesus did on Holy Week or during Holy Week. And so to be able to dive into the depths of that water helps us to get a bigger picture of not only who he is, but what he's done and the implications in our lives as well.
That's good. That's good. So funneling down just a little bit or zooming in from Passion Week, Holy Week as a whole, today's episode, we're covering Palm Sunday, Temple Monday. If we were one of the closer followers of Jesus and we're making that first journey from Lazarus's new birthday party up to Jerusalem, what would we anticipate that those close followers were feeling on that journey up? Are they excited? Are they timid? What are they feeling?
Yeah, I think it's a combination of the two. I think if you look at the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, you see the journey. Majority of the synoptic gospels occur in Galilee, right? Majority of John's gospel occurs in Jerusalem. So when you look at the synoptic gospels, you're looking at a journey from the north in the area of Galilee, moving all the way up to Caesarea Philippi, which was in the very north, the combination of Lebanon, Syria, and Israel today, and around the Sea of Galilee. Now Jesus making his way, setting his face like flint toward Jerusalem.
Love that phrase.
Coming down the Jordan, going through what was Jericho. It would be even new city Jericho for him, because the old city was destroyed.
It's gone.
It's gone. But he runs into who Matthew calls blind Bartimaeus. And that's the context here. On his way out of Jericho to the east into Bethany, which would be his home base and their home base for the week. Along the way in the synoptics, I think we get several instances where the disciples warn him not to go to Jerusalem. So I think there was fear and trepidation. I think they could sense the rising vitriol of the religious leaders, specifically the Pharisees, but all the sects, and especially, the chief priests, who were seeing what Jesus was doing. They were getting reports back about him. John the Baptist has already been beheaded. We understand that the forerunner's gone. And Jesus is making his way south now, and I can see how the disciples are incredibly concerned about that. Now, I think that there's a tipping point there. There's a change that happens, and that happens at the tomb of Lazarus.
Yeah,
because when they come, and he gets the word that Lazarus is sick, and he delays, and Lazarus dies, and 4 days later he shows up in Bethany and is, I'm going to put this maybe in a way that I've never said it before, but accosted by Lazarus's two sisters, chastised, criticized,
blamed,
that he didn't show up. He could have done something, and this is the new Pastor Jim version of the Bible, but I'm thinking Jesus is going, I'm going to do something.
Yeah.
It just wasn't time to do it yet. Now it's time to do it. And, his words would have been so that the kingdom of God could be revealed, and so that he raises Lazarus from the dead. Now I'm thinking from the disciples' perspective of coming down from the north going, we may be going to our death with him. He just raised Lazarus from the dead. Maybe we aren't.
Yeah. Oh, that's a good point.
And so the idea of we've seen him walk on water, we've seen him multiply bread and fish, we've seen him turn water into wine, we've seen him heal the unhealable. Yeah. We've seen him, even just in Jericho, heal a blind man and pay attention to the poor and the outcast. All these things have happened over a 3-year period, but resurrection from the dead, except for the young girl, is right in front of them now before they step into Jerusalem. And I think it moves a little bit from trepidation to inauguration in their mind.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
It does make sense.
And wow, hold on. This is going to be good.
Yeah, that's good.
And so I think that's where they find themselves at the precipice of Bethany and Bethpage moving toward toward Jerusalem.
So Jesus, Palm Sunday, and this was on the March 2nd sermon. If people miss it, go back. I'd recommend it. But we're walking into a parade in Jerusalem. Jerusalem's full, right? It's Passover week. About how many people could we anticipate, to our best knowledge?
Yeah,
we're in Jerusalem about that time.
Yeah, it's a guesstimate, but most scholars would say that the resident population in Jerusalem was probably around 25,000 people in the first century. Today, it's about 900,000, maybe right at 1 million, somewhere right in that range.
Yeah.
But I think we forget as Westerners how small a country Israel is.
Yeah.
When I was there 2 years ago, I was just overwhelmed by the smallness of all of it. It shrunk my context for the New Testament. I know that sounds really strange, but when I was staying in Tiberias, which is a city on the Sea of Galilee, and I'm looking across to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, in my mind, it was much bigger than I thought it was going to be. In my mind, it was much bigger than what I was looking at, right? Yeah. And in the same mode, the next day, I saw a squall come down on the sea and have white caps. And I'm like, oh, that's how that happens. That's how storms come into this sea that is below sea level.
Yeah.
Right. And stirs up these storms, this huge lake. So I think, and even in Jerusalem, I mean, walking from the Mount of Olives to Caiaphas' house is a football field or two.
Oh, wow.
So it's not very far away from one another.
It's all close.
It's all close. It's not Texas, you know? So I think part of that context is to realize, the geography and everything that's going on in Jerusalem at the time is much smaller than we think. So resident population of about 25,000 during the festivals, whichever festival that might be, Passover being kind of the big boy, the Super Bowl, if you will. Probably swells up to 150 to 160,000 people. So just think about it. Let's try to put it in Texas terms. You take the population of Parker County and put them in Stephenville. Mm-hmm. I mean, Stephenville was about 23,000, right? So you take all the population of Parker County and you take them all to Stephenville at one time. Well, you're overrunning the place, right? So that would be a good feel of what Jerusalem looked like during a festival, specifically in Passover.
I think that's one of those nuanced details or minute details that does add to the nuance, though, because we're not going, if we've traveled to Jerusalem for Passover, there might be a sense of obligation or duty, but I'm going to presume this is not a trip of drudgery as we make our way up to Jerusalem. Like, this is something that we might have had to save up shekels for sure to get there. Our family is making an investment in it. There's probably a layer of excitement on the way. And part of what floats around in the scene in my mind is, when people are out of town and when the bulk of the people, I'm thinking of tourist destinations, that they don't want to miss what's happening. So I'm imagining that that's adding to the fervor. You've got Jesus, this famous rabbi coming in. Some rumors about Lazarus have made their way in. I'm imagining that has helped to amplify
I think so.
the fervor in a town that's already probably buzzing, right?
I think it's buzzing. I would probably say there's probably a little bit of both. I think there are religious pilgrims that came in who were Jews.
Yes.
Who are going because that's what they have to do.
Yes.
It's just like people who feel like they have to go to church on Sunday because it's what my mama
This is
wants
what we
me
do.
to do. This is what we do. And then I think there are very faithful Jews that realize the implications of Passover, that they get the story, they get the Moses story, they get the Exodus story, they get God sparing those who slaughtered a lamb and put blood over the doorpost or over the door sill and the post of the house, and the firstborn of the Egyptian children were killed, but they weren't. And that story still held resonance that many thousands of years later in the life of the Jewish people, especially under persecution, because I think one of the things we forget is they're under Roman occupation.
Yep.
Now, that comes into the story later on during Holy Week when Pilate comes into the mix. But I think we forget that they've lived under oppression now for decades. And as a result of that, the Passover is a reminder that God has the ability to deliver. And the prescient tension of coming Messiah is consistently with those people in the first century.
Yeah.
And so the idea that could our deliverer be coming, could it be this year? Could it be this man?
Could it be that empty seat
That's
that we have on Thursday night gets filled this year?
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. And so the idea then of Passover being one of those times, not just to look back, but to look forward, I think is something we don't consider much when we think of that celebration in Jerusalem in 30 to 33 AD. Yeah.
That's good. That's good. So I like just kind of dwelling on the crowd that happens here for a number of reasons. But in this crowd, in the moment of Christ's arrival, and we see the laying down of palms and the removing of their cloaks and laying them down before him, do we see in the crowd true worship or something that is polluted with self-interest? Or yes.
Yes, it's like every Sunday morning. For us as Christians, there's people who show up to think that they're going to earn God's favor. There are people that show up that truly run after Jesus. There are people that show up because they don't know what else to do.
Yeah.
There are people that show up simply because the crowd showed up. So I think it's a little bit of all. In Mark's gospel, which is what I preached out of in the first message in this series, we see that the disciples, Mark says, went before and came behind him worshiping him. So we know that there was true worship in the sense of those who were closest to Jesus.
That's good.
But it might act as kind of a concentric circles of relationship, that the closer you are to him, the more you realize who he is.
Yeah.
And then as you move out from him, the more you realize, oh, these people are just window shopping.
Yeah.
Even to the point, and I can't remember which gospel it's in, it's not in Mark, where some of the religious leaders tell Jesus to tell his disciples to settle down.
Absolutely.
And he says, hey, if they're quiet, even the rocks will cry out. Right?
Oh, yeah.
And so you get to the outskirts of the crowd, to the outliers themselves, and it doesn't look a lot like worship.
Yeah.
But the frenzy in the middle, I think, is the interesting point.
Yeah.
Is the anticipation and the hope of something's going to happen. Whether they would claim that he is the Messiah or not might be a different conversation. But the idea that we've heard of him, I mean, not to be too pejorative here, but he was a rock star. I mean, at this point, after 3 years, there's probably very few people in Judea who had not heard of Jesus of Nazareth. Obviously, the authorities had, right? Witness is starting to spread through those he's healed, through those that he's helped, through his disciples, those who have placed,
fed.
those he fed. I mean, you're looking at a 5,000 and 4,000, population of groups that he sent away. Well, you can't tell me some of those didn't go back to Jerusalem. Of course they did.
Yeah.
So they're telling everybody, hey, I was sitting on this hillside in Galilee, and let me tell you what this guy named Jesus, a rabbi named Jesus, did. And all of a sudden, that gets seeded in the ears and the minds and the hearts of people. And it's not like Jesus had never been to Passover before. He had probably gone every year as a faithful Jew, right? We know he went as a child because he got stuck in the temple courts talking to the priests, and his parents ran off and left him. That's a whole nother story. But to know that he was there and he had been to Jerusalem many times, and now though with Passover happening and him and the Roman oppression, all these things kind of coming to a head in at least in the narrative of the Gospels, something different's happening here. And I think the resurrection of Lazarus is a key point of why that's happening here.
Yeah, it's not the direction we anticipated going with this, but as you're speaking of specifically, when you mentioned, fed 5,000 men plus their families, fed 4,000 men plus their families. Those people go back home. And the whole time in the ministry of Jesus, one of the things that he keeps either expressing explicitly or alluding to is, my time has not yet come.
Right. Yeah.
My time has not yet come. My time has not yet come. And now we have, hey, it's kickoff.
Yeah, it is.
And here's what I find interesting. If I'm benevolent world dictator, which I would be very benevolent.
Yes, we would hope.
I'm spending those 3 years making sure that at the moment of kickoff, everybody already knows.
Right.
So I'm constantly false starting and jumping the gun on God's plan because I'm worried that people aren't going to know and they're not going to be there to show up, except that there were 5,000 people 5,000 men and their families that then went to their villages and talked about it. Out of the villages that would have the people that would be making the pilgrimage up to Jerusalem for Passover. And the same thing with the four and all the different populations that learned of his ministry. And I'm just kind of impressed with if I will just trust him in his timing, then when the time has come for that event's kickoff, he's got it taken care of.
That's right.
He's worshiped right there.
Right there.
They didn't post it on anything online. I hate the illustrations.
I know.
That do that.
I get it.
There was not an intentional marketing plan relative to their day.
Right.
And he is still worshipped by the masses.
There's no one handing out parchment in the temple going,
Yeah.
he's coming tomorrow.
So I don't
Yeah.
have to fret
Yeah.
about the timing and controlling the process. I can just trust him through it.
And there's a great incident that happened, I think it was about a year before, at the Festival of Booths, or the Festival of Tents, which celebrated the time in the wilderness and God's provision.
Celebrated the wilderness.
Celebrated God's provision.
Easy
and
for me to
protection
celebrate the wilderness.
in the wilderness, not celebrated the
in my ranch
you know
style
what
home.
I'm saying. But his brothers are going.
Yeah.
You know, his extended family's going to the festival, and they said, you need to come and let everybody know who you are.
Yeah.
And he says, I'm not going. And they go, but you need to come and you need to let them know that you are the one. You're the Messiah. And he says, I'm not going. And then like a day or two later, he shows up.
Incognito.
But he starts teaching in the temple and doing what Jesus does when he goes to Jerusalem. And, you know, anybody reading the Gospels like that is going, hold on, did he just lie to his brothers? Knowing that the New Testament attests that he never sinned? What's going on here? That wasn't about truth-telling or lying. It was about being a part of the Father's agenda and not man's agenda.
Yeah.
He wasn't going to be pressed where man wanted him to go, even his family. He was going to be obedient to the Father. Now, did the Father want him at the festival a year before? Sure he did.
Yeah.
But he was going to go on the Father's agenda and timing, and not on his brother's agenda and timing, because his time had not yet come. And so I think we get to Passover in the last week of Jesus' life, and you don't see anybody pressing. You see Jesus leading. And that kind of changes everything.
That gets me.
Yeah. You see Jesus totally sovereign and in control of himself, even when we talk about Monday.
Yeah.
And you see him in charge of the situation.
That's good.
And I mean, and we're going to jump ahead too quick, but even on Monday and even early Friday morning, you see Jesus fully in control of the whole thing. And nobody's saying this. You see someone extremely frustrated that they can't press him. And he ends up hanging himself in the end.
Yeah.
So the idea that, I don't know, there's a shift in the narrative after his arrival in Bethany and the resurrection of Lazarus, which was a demonstration of the power and the kingdom of God, that now to the forefront, it's not really the crowd dictating anything, it's Jesus dictating everything.
Yeah.
Which he was never out of control.
No.
But
he's exercising it differently.
it's the face like flint thing. You feel that in the narrative now.
That's good. That's very insightful. A final question about Sunday before we shift to talking about Monday. I mean, there's that massive parade, and I get to be part of a generation that's driven by FOMO. Do we, as modern believers,
Fear of missing out.
Yep.
For those of you of older generations who may not get that acronym.
I may neglect a responsibility because I don't want to miss out on an experience that others are indulging in. As a believer today, I can't go back in time to Palm Sunday.
Right.
Is there a different type of parade and arrival for me to anticipate and look forward to?
Well, I think, because I think twofold. I think you can anticipate it and experience it in the present. And obviously there's one in the future. But the one in the present, I think, centers around the idea of the kingdom of God. And that when you realize that you're in the kingdom of God, if you have a faith relationship with Jesus Christ, then the parade's happening right now. The kingdom of God is going out into the world through believers and corporate gatherings of believers called the local church, and therefore we are on parade singing Hosanna.
Let's go.
That he saves. That's evangelism.
Yeah.
That's the first step in disciple making, is proclaiming Hosanna. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. And we are proclaiming that in everything we do and everything we say if we're walking faithfully with Jesus as a local church. So I do think there is a parade of sorts going on right now.
I love that.
And then there will be a parade going on, but it's going to look a lot different because the in and out thing is going to be a little more black and white.
Yeah.
And because, the idea of the return of Christ is what we're talking about, obviously, if you're not cluing into that yet. But when Jesus comes as king again, because Palm Sunday is all about his arrival as king, as Messiah on the back of a donkey, when he returns again on a war horse, at least the image of that in Revelation, he's not returning as one who is going to suffer. He's returning as one who will conquer. And that's a different type of parade.
Yeah.
So I think for believers, we can rejoice in Hosanna, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord now, because we have been invited into his mission to reclaim and redeem and renew the world. And we can proclaim Hosanna, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, and the victory is won in the end. So,
Absolutely.
both and.
So if the responsibility on Palm Sunday was celebrating and worshiping, then hopefully as our responsibility and participation now is celebrating and worshiping. We're celebrating and worshiping.
Yeah.
That's good. So he shows up to Jerusalem, takes a gander. Just a quick little, can I use the restroom real quick? And then heads back out of town. That might be blasphemous.
It might.
It was quick, though.
It was
just
quick.
a quick stop and then heads back out because the parade's over.
Yeah.
Jesus returns on Monday to Jerusalem.
Right.
There's two main scenes, right? On Monday, you have the curse of the fig tree, and then you have what takes place in the temple. So just a brief, I do want to give a moment to the fig tree. Why does Jesus hate trees?
Yeah. Well, it's funny because my daughter asked that. Why didn't Jesus like fruit, Dad?
Yeah.
That has nothing to do with it.
Yeah. Absolutely.
This has absolutely nothing to do with it. Though trees would play a big part in the last week of Jesus' life. Obviously, the fig tree, going and coming, and then eventually to the cross. And so that does play a part. I don't think we need to go very far down that road. But, I think the big theme here, and we've talked about it on a previous podcast, is the theme of temples. So the idea of his destination, and maybe this isn't something we thought about on that Palm Sunday. What was his destination?
The temple.
We always say Jerusalem, but it really was the temple.
He went through Jerusalem.
He went in through the eastern gate, which was the shortest entrance from an outer wall into the temple courts.
That's great.
He goes into the temple courts. In Mark's gospel, we see in our study that he looks around the temple. It's late, heads back out 2 miles to Bethany, spends the night, eats dinner, spends the night, whatever they do.
Yeah.
Comes back in the next morning, sees a fig tree, has not produced figs. Curses the fig tree, it withers, right?
Yeah.
So the idea behind that is still temple related.
Yep.
So that becomes an illustration for the disciples of the fruitlessness of religion.
Yeah.
And the fruitlessness of what the temple has become, which we're about to see when he goes back into the temple.
Absolutely.
Because of his actions that he takes in the temple courts on Monday morning we know the Lord's Supper and the Last Supper is a lived parable. This might also be a lived parable. So here's the illustration of the tree. Now let me go show you what that means in context in the life of the temple on Monday morning. And it was all confusing. It would have been confusing for me.
Absolutely.
What do figs have to do with this? But yeah, I think, and then we see temple stuff happening all the way through, even proclamations, even accusations. You said you would tear down the temple in 3 days and rebuild it.
Yeah.
What? Of course, he was talking about himself.
Absolutely.
And not the physical building, but he was also prophesying towards 70 AD when the Romans would destroy the temple in Jerusalem, never to be rebuilt again.
That's good.
So I think with the fig tree, to answer your question, it was a moment to illustrate they were about to experience. The disciples were in the temple proper, especially in the court of the Gentiles.
Oh yeah, I've kept in my mind regarding this particular fig tree. Just the idea of what me and some friends used to call a 40-yard fake out, where from a distance this appears to have life, literal fruit on it. Right. It's got enough from 40 yards that indicates this should have it. From a distance, that temple looks like it should have worship.
Right.
It should have true worship to God. But whenever I get up close, it's lifeless.
Yeah. And remember that it's Passover. It's supposed to be the time of worship.
Yeah. This is why we've swollen up.
This is why we've swollen the city. This is what's going on.
Why do you think it was essential that on Monday he go into the temple?
It's interesting. It's a good question. A lot of scholars think that there were two, what we call the cleansing of the temple.
Okay. Yes.
Okay. So the cleansing of the temple in John's gospel is in chapter 2.
Mm-hmm.
The cleansing of the temple in the three synoptics are during Passion Week.
Yeah.
Many scholars believe that he actually did this twice.
Yeah.
And that John's just isn't out of order, right? Reminding us that
His best friend wasn't confused.
wasn't confused about timelines, right? And that most of John's gospel happened in and around Jerusalem. They do go to Galilee in that gospel, but most of it happens in and around Jerusalem and in and around the temple. But even if John was going to say, got the timeline confused, why would he put it in chapter 2?
Yeah.
Right? I mean, no. So this most likely happened twice for different reasons and to tell different stories.
Yeah.
And we have to remember that these are not, the Gospels themselves are not biographies, they're testimonies
Yeah.
of the individual author's perception and collection of stories around the life of Jesus, right? So especially around his 3 years of public ministry. So anyway, back to him going into the temple. Temple ends up playing this huge role all the way through Holy Week. And so I think the impetus for him going into the temple was to teach again.
Yeah.
But I think the key, especially after the fig tree, is to exert what he had proclaimed to be Sunday.
That's great.
That he is Lord over the temple.
Yeah.
That the Lord of the temple has returned. Right?
Yeah.
Because we're in a dry season of prophecy. I think we forget that.
Yeah.
That between Malachi and Matthew, nothing.
Cloud's not hanging over the temple
Cloud's
anymore.
not hanging over the temple anymore.
Yeah.
Where is God? We're being faithful in our religiosity, in what we've called dead orthodoxy, of just doing it. I'm not saying there weren't faithful Jews. There were a lot of faithful Jews.
Yeah.
And we see them in Nicodemus and Joseph, and we see them in some of Joseph of Arimathea.
Yeah.
And we see a lot of faithful Jews who are seeking after Yahweh, and Yahweh seems to remain silent. And now Jesus walks in. First of all, he rides in, which was messianic. Now he comes in and performs something to exert authority in the temple.
Yeah.
Now the Sadducees were over the temple.
Yeah.
Right? That sect of Judaism. And Jesus is usurping their authority because he's Lord over the temple. He is the God who dwells in the temple.
Yeah.
Woo, that'll mess you up. And now when he goes in on that Monday, he's demonstrating what he had symbolically done on the donkey the day before.
That's great. And he gets in there with the Sadducees, right? He kicks off with your time is done.
Yeah.
We looked at it last Thursday in the college ministry, because one of the exciting things for me personally is, a year ago we're praying through and we plan what we'll do for this calendar year. And then here God has everything line up where we are now lockstep with Sunday mornings, which is really cool. Also intimidating because for 2 weeks I'm one chapter ahead of Sunday morning.
Oh, good.
So it's like I'm not going to say too much lest on Sunday morning Dr. Thomas say something and all of you turn around and look at me.
No, they're going.
He corrected
Man,
it.
I can't believe he can't. I'm glad. I can't believe our pastor didn't get that right.
No.
Andy, correct him this week.
But Jesus gets in the temple, right? It's a famous clearing out of the temple. One of the things that has been impressed on my life in this is where this takes place.
Yeah.
It was not in the temple. It was not outside.
Right.
Right. Where is he clearing the temple at?
Yeah, in the court of the Gentiles.
And what is for the modern listener who's not familiar with Gentile Jewish relationships in first century AD? What is the actual purpose of the court of the Gentiles?
Well, the court of the Gentiles, it's interesting. Several groups were welcome, and the Jews they kind of had an open door policy.
Okay.
So you did have Jewish proselytes that were Gentile by birth.
Yeah.
Right? And so they would come into the court of the Gentiles. There would be some Gentiles that were just, as we call it, window shopping.
Yeah.
And there were some that were polytheist who added Yahweh to their list of polytheism.
Still a Hellenist world at the time.
Still a Hellenist world at the time, a Greek world. That's what that word means. And so you still had this polytheism in the Greek world. Obviously those are probably the more well-known gods, lowercase g, with Zeus and Athena and blah, 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 mythology. And then the Romans basically co-opted those gods and gave them new names, which is where we get Jupiter and Pluto and all the planet kind of stuff, Mercury, all that kind of stuff's happening from Roman world. Well, if you're polytheistic, not unlike, say, a Hindu nowadays, where you worship a pantheon of gods, this thousands of gods or however many you want to, and you may have your favorites because they speak into your life. You craft them after your need, if you will. I need a better crop, or I need this, or I need that. Well, Yahweh is a new one I learned about, and maybe Yahweh is going to help me with something too.
Yeah.
And one of the things Yahweh requires is a pilgrimage to Jerusalem in Judea. And I'm going to go there during a high holy feast, and I'm going to worship. But as far as I can get in is what the Jews call the court of the Gentiles.
That's good.
So those are the outer courts surrounding the temple proper, but inside the walls of the temple.
And so if I am a Gentile follower of Yahweh, is this in my worship at the temple? Do I pass through this to go somewhere else to worship?
No, it's a stopping point.
This is where I'm at.
Yeah, and it's sad because I mean there was an open door policy. There was a somewhat of a generous orthodoxy with the Jews at the time, but you can even just tell how narrow that gets because the next court is a court of women, and that's as far as women could go. Okay. And then only Jewish men could go beyond that. So you kind of see the patriarchal world that they still lived in at the time. It's there. And the religio-political world that they lived in at the time, because if you're a Gentile, then you can't, and it's the largest space in the temple. Isn't that interesting? Yeah. Largest space in the temple are the courts of the Gentiles. But you can't go beyond that if you're a Gentile. Yeah.
So this area is now full of the money changers, ripping people off. So we've polluted the space that's actually kind of set aside for people to be able to worship. But Jesus isn't just blowing off steam here, right? I've always taken issue with let me use this example to justify my unfiltered expression of my anger.
That's right.
What is Jesus doing when he's clearing the temple?
Yeah, I mentioned it in the sermon based on Monday, but the idea of holy discontent. Okay. That Jesus has on the negative side holy discontent, on the positive side holy indignation. Okay. For the proper worship of Yahweh in the temple, right? Yeah. And so what's going on in the court of the Gentiles, and we basically have two groups that he deals with, right? We have the money changers and we have those with livestock, okay? Yeah. Two different issues. So you had to pay a temple tax, the Tyrian tax, I believe it was called. Okay. That was required for the temple to keep up the temple, but that's your tax you have to pay to be able to sacrifice in the temple. Then you had to have a sacrifice, a pure sacrifice, right? Well, it wasn't the issue. It was an issue that they had brought the market in. That's one of the issues, but one of the other issues is the false dealing within the market, and the lack of integrity that there was among the money changers. So, to get that coin, that Jewish coin, which would have no image on it, because that would be idolatry, you had to exchange whatever coins you had. Those could be Roman coins, they could be African coins, they could be Greek coins, they could be coins from all over the world. Yeah. But if you're going to truly make a sacrifice and give an offering to the temple, those had to be exchanged. Well, the annual percentage rate on, I don't know, we're getting into math, that's going to mess me up, but the interest rate on what those money changers was just exorbitant. They were just making a killing on people. Yeah. Right? And in doing so, they were defiling the temple. They were defiling the pure worship of Yahweh, because they were fleecing the flock for their own purses. Absolutely. Right? And so I think with that and with the livestock in there, then the purpose of that place, how can you meditate and think on the goodness of God passing over the Jewish houses in Egypt when you're being run over by cattle and sheep, specifically lambs at that time for the Passover? Yeah. And the bleeding in your ear and people bargaining for things and money changers clinking coins. That's not a place of worship. Yeah. Right? It's a marketplace. Yeah. And I think that's why Jesus had holy indignation and holy discontent for what was going on.
So getting more personal than we're not going to have a cattle sale on Sunday mornings in the worship center. We'll save that for the gym. Is there a takeaway or an application in this for the life of the follower regarding a space meant for worship or something meant to be a pure worship towards God?
Well,
distraction.
Yeah, isn't it interesting? Should we have a respect for the church house? Let's just put it in very Western language.
Love that phrase. I love that
Yeah,
phrase.
so of course we should to a degree, but one thing we need to remember is let's not deify a building.
That's good.
Right?
That's good.
Jesus, when talking to the woman at the well, they got into a conversation, well, really she did, about the place of worship.
Yep.
You Jews say we should worship in Jerusalem, but we Samaritans worship on this mountain, blah, blah, blah. And Jesus goes, yeah, but when you're not going to worship really in either place coming up, you're going to worship the Father in spirit and in truth.
Absolutely.
So Jesus does what he does. He turns everything upside down, and he takes the idea of worship as being a place and even a time to being an attitude of the heart and the mind. That even rhymed. Wow, I can't believe I just did that. But the idea that and we've seen it, I've done it, we see it in churches, I've seen it my whole life, people going to a worship service instead of worshiping.
Yes.
Does that make sense?
It does.
So the idea of, going into a place and basically worshiping the event or worshiping the space instead of worshiping the God in the space.
Yeah.
And I think that's a very dangerous thing to do. And so, we need to be good stewards of the space. I'm not saying that. We
Absolutely.
do, right? But when we come, are we coming there to attend an event or to encounter the God that we've walked with all week corporately? And that's a whole different mindset.
It is. And I think that second part is what allows us to keep a finger on the pulse of what we're actually doing, right? It's if I am consistently walking with him, right? How do you spot the counterfeit? We have to know the authentic.
Right.
If I'm consistently walking with him, it's going to help me be better able to recognize, am I in this space worshiping?
Yeah.
Or am I worshiping this space?
That's big.
And that's how that's the deception that Satan wants to make, right? For me to take something that God has given as good and to twist it for me to worship anything but God.
And Jesus talked about the Sabbath regarding that exact thing.
Yes.
He talked about a lot of things regarding that, of how we can take the physical aspects of this world that are modes or environments for us to encounter the one true God and deify those things.
Yeah.
And that's idolatry.
Absolutely.
Now, again, I think there's an issue of stewardship that we have to pay attention to, and we need to steward the resources that God's given us well, whether it be a building or whether it be a time or whether it be whatever it happens to be. But, we get to a place where we deify the space and we deify a moment to where a kid running in the church becomes sin, or a lost teenager walking in wearing a ball cap needs to be thrown out, or all of a sudden we've turned into the Sadducees. And I'm just wondering if Jesus sitting in the corner making a whip.
Yeah.
Yeah. Which, by the way, was extremely intentional. He didn't react out of some untoward form of anger. And I talked about all that in the message for this day. But the idea that he is going to drive false expressions of worship away.
That's good.
Because they don't glorify him.
And when he points out my false expression, how do I respond? Do I wait till he leaves and build my booth back up again?
That's right.
Or do I recognize this as an opportunity for repentance, belief, and fellowship?
That's right. That's exactly
That's good. Well, that's going to do it for today. And as we spoke earlier, right, this season is a great time to heighten my awareness of the work of Christ and lean in deeper into what's going on with Easter. Dr. Thomas wrote, and it is available through the church and also on Amazon, just this 8 days devotional. You didn't know I was going to do this.
I didn't know you were going to do
So
this.
if you're turning red and you're watching the video, it's because I've decided to do this. But it is a daily devotional from now through Easter that expounds upon what we have heard in the prior Sunday sermon. I've read through half of it, and truthfully, it's very insightful, very helpful, very great prompting in it.
Amen.
So yeah, I would highly encourage that, and we'll see you next time.